could, I'm going to skip a class. So the first lecture of chapter 5 is loaded under lecture meetings, but you have to scroll all the way down to the bottom. There's a PowerPoint there that is narrated, because the first part of chapter 5 is A&P stuff again, so it should be reviewed for everybody. All right, and then on Wednesday we'll jump into the second lecture in chapter 5. Friday we'll finish chapter 5. The following Monday we'll have review, and the following Wednesday we'll have the exam. So the exam's going to move down one session. Okay? All right. So the exam will be on the 27th rather than the 1st of March. Okay? So if anybody can't make the 27th, let me know so that we can rearrange for that. Okay. All right.
We won't be here on the 27th.
Okay.
You got any?
So then we can plan for, do you want to take it before you leave? Do you want to take it when you get back?
We'll already be on the road from the 23rd to like the 20th.
Ooh, wow. Okay, yeah, he did say that was a long trip. So then we'll need to plan for it after you get back, probably. Yeah. Let's just make a plan before you leave so that we know when you're going to do it.
All right.
Okay? All right.
So,
Yes?
is the narrative one for Wednesday or is it like Monday? Like, when are we supposed to watch it before?
Before Wednesday.
Oh, okay.
Okay, any questions on muscle fiber type, sliding filament theory? Anything that we've done up to this point?
Yeah, did you find out the answer to that question?
No, I thought about it, but I had a bank problem in the UK that I had to deal with, and some graduate papers that they decided they wanted graded, well, feedback on. So no, I thought about it this morning, and then I didn't have time to look at it. So I'm going to come back to it. It's not that I forgot, I just
No, that's fine.
did not have time, because I'm trying to, I was thinking about it this morning. I wonder if it's that is it just that the myosin ATPase works more efficiently, or is it that there are more heads and more attachment points in a myosin in a type 2 fiber? So I think it's a really great question. I just
Okay.
have to work out where to go to find the answer.
Okay.
So, okay, all right, so we understand how we think the muscle is contracting, all right, and the fact that it can't physically, bless you, relax. It has to rely on either an antagonistic action or gravity to stretch it, to pull on the bone and therefore stretch the muscle back out. All right? So we have 3 types of muscle contraction, okay, using our sliding filament theory. So the first one is the one that we've kind of looked at and thought about, it's the most obvious, is called concentric. It's where the muscle shortens. All right, so that animation that we looked at gave a very good picture of the sarcomere shortening and therefore the muscle shortening. All right, so when it contracts like this and the muscle is shortening, that means that the amount of force that that muscle is able to produce is larger than the amount of force in the resistance. All right? So if you think about it, a really easy way to consider it is your bicep curl. All right? If I'm able to shorten the bicep, that means my bicep was strong enough to overcome the force, the amount of weight that I'm lifting. Right? Does that make sense? So if I have concentric action, the muscle is creating more force than the resistance that's being applied. Okay. The one in between is isometric. And when we do an isometric contraction, we see no change in the length of the muscle. So in this case, the force that the muscle is producing equals the force of resistance. All right. So we sometimes use isometric work, like pushing against ourselves or pushing against a wall. Right? They often will use isometric work in rehab after surgery because they don't want you contracting the muscle and yanking on stitches that are in the muscle or in the tendon or the ligament. So they want to create strengthening exercises that aren't going to disrupt the healing around the surgery. Right? So isometrics are used quite often in that case. If you do planks in yoga, so like you hold a push-up position and you just hold it and hold it and hold it, that's an isometric exercise, right? Anything where you're creating force, but the length of the muscle is not altering. Yes?
What about like an air chair? Because you're like,
A what, sorry?
an air chair where you're like, where you're like standing against a wall and you like go into like a squat and you like
Oh, and you
back
just hold it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, wall sits, like that they, so the skiers do a lot of wall sit
Yeah,
type.
are those isometric?
Yes, yeah. Once you're in the position, they are, yes.
It's awesome.
No.
That's what I grew up learning.
I like it, chairs, I think that's a good one. All right.
I guess that's not under.
So then the third version is eccentric, right? And when we have an eccentric action, it means that there is force within the muscle, but the resistance that the muscle is working against is larger, right? And so the muscle is getting longer, but it's not getting longer because it's turned off. The muscle is contracting, but it's getting pulled out at the same time. Okay? So that can happen under a couple of different circumstances. All right? The first one is when the maximum force that that muscle can produce isn't large enough to manage the resistance that's being applied. And so the resistance is pulling the muscle longer. Right? The second instance is when your central nervous system deliberately turns down the force application so that the muscle can lengthen under tension. So a good example of that is if we're squatting, right? So if I have my bar and I squat, my quads are not turned off, they're not relaxed, right? I'm going down under control. Your coach can't read either.
That's done.
Oh, he can't read either. What's wrong with these people? So, from here, right, when I go down, that's not a relaxation, right, ever. I go down under control, and then I push back up again. So the down is eccentric and the up is concentric. Right? It's not that I can't push this amount of weight, it's that I want to push it from down there. So I have to get down there, under control. Right? Does that make sense?
And with any given movement, different muscles are going to be contracted.
Yeah. Right, so eccentric means the muscle is lengthening under force, either because the resistance is larger than the muscle is strong, or because I want to be in a position that under control. Okay? Yes.
So in a bicep curl, you said this would be concentric when you're releasing it, when you're releasing it.
Eccentric. Should be. Should
Instead
be.
of dropping.
If you're doing the movement correctly, this should be eccentric.
Okay.
Yeah. So, which of the three types of muscle action is the strongest and creates the most amount of damage? Okay. So if we look at this graph, on the x-axis we have velocity, okay, and on the y-axis we have force. All right. So 0 velocity means the muscle is not changing length, so 0 has to be our isometric. When we look at concentric, we're shortening, so we're coming to the right. And initially, the amount of force is quite strong, but the faster we go, the less force we're able to produce. So one take home from the graph is that the faster I contract short, the less force I can apply. But the other picture to take home is that it doesn't matter what level of concentric action I'm performing, the force I'm producing is always less than I can produce isometrically. Which is another reason why they like to use isometric exercises in rehab, because you're actually having to produce more force, and therefore you're making the muscle stronger than doing concentric work. Okay. Then if we look at eccentric work, eccentric is lengthening, so we're going to the left, right? And what we find with eccentric is the faster I go, the stronger the contraction is. So it's the other way around to the concentric. So the faster I go, the more force I have to produce to control the movement, right? But the other picture is, whatever eccentric work I'm doing is more force production than any isometric work I can do, and more force production than any concentric work I can do. Okay. So eccentric work is often called a mechanical stressor, because the amount of force that is necessary to do eccentric work is so much larger than the other two, right? So this is an interesting segue to looking at different weightlifting programs, okay? Because we often think when we're lifting that the strong part of the move is the up, right? But it isn't. The strong part of the move is the control back down, right? So we do way more work on the way down against gravity than we do on the way up. Which is why people who do serious heavy weight programs use negatives, right? And why you can't do negatives without a partner. Because if you've got enough weight on the bar to do the negative, you can't get it back up on your own, right? You have to have help to get it back up. Does that make sense? Right? So negatives are one of the most effective ways to get stronger, but you've got to have really good technique. You've got to have a training partner who knows what they're doing and knows how to spot properly. Right? Yes?
What is a negative?
So like, what,
Oh, so negatives are where you only do half the skill. So if I'm benching,
you only go down, but you
I only go down, and then my partner helps come back up. Same with a squat. I do the down, and they do the up. But because the down can create more force, then the weight I have on the bar to do the down, I can't get the bar back up on my own.
It's mostly your shoulder.
Yeah, you have to have help. Right? Very effective, but not something to do with beginners. You've got to have someone who's super knowledgeable about lifting and technique. Yeah.
so like, the longer that you take to go down is more effective than like, so like a 10 count is better than like a 3 count when you're going down?
If you go faster, you create more force. You've also, though, got to stop it, which means either you need a partner who really knows how to spot well. I think it's safer to work in here and do the longer count than the fast down and push out. Because you don't, here's the thing, when you do it fast, you don't want the fast to be a collapse. It's not I'm turning the muscles off and dropping the weight. It's I'm controlling the weight down quickly. So the quicker you can control it, the more force you will produce. But you've got to stop it at the bottom without blowing out your elbow or your shoulder, or right? So I think there's a bit of a trade-off. I mean, I'm not knowledgeable enough about training programs. LB would know better. But my experience with negatives is that we want to kind of work around here, so that if by chance I drop it and my partner isn't paying attention, because they're eyeing up the girlie over the other side instead of watching me, right? That I don't drop it so fast that it clonks me on the chest. Because they do that, those guys. They do not pay attention. So, one of the reasons that we think that this eccentric load is creating more force comes back to that elastic component in the epimysium, endomysium, perimysium again, in that connective tissue, that in some way, by using that elastic component, somehow that's helping us to make more force. But we don't really understand yet what's going on in the muscle. training of any kind creates damage to the muscle tissue, microtrauma, right? And so when we train, if we've had a few days off or a week off or a couple of months off, or we seriously up our workload in the gym, then quite often we're going to get sore, right? So is sore good or bad is one question, right? What causes the soreness is an interesting question. Okay? So DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, we get that kind of acute soreness that happens in the gym. If I'm working really hard, then I feel kind of tight and a little bit sore. But that isn't what we're talking about. What we're talking about is what happens 24 to 48 hours later, right? So that point where you do that really heavy bench and then you get up the next day and you're like, oh, that's not too bad, I got away with that. And then you get up the next day and you're like, okay, I can't get my shirt on, right? Or you do the squat, and then you go to the loo, and then you're like, okay, I can't get back up off the loo, right? That kind of soreness is what we're talking about. Okay? So, because eccentric action creates more force, it does more damage. Okay? And so our DOMS is primarily the result of the eccentric work within any movement that you do, not the concentric work. Right? So downhill running, if you run hills, the downhill portion of the hill makes you way more sore than the uphill portion of the hill. And the downhill portion makes your legs stronger. The uphill portion makes your heart stronger. The downhill portion makes your legs stronger. Right? So if you run up and you walk down, you don't get sore. But if you run up and you run down, your legs are going to get more sore. Right? Because the amount of eccentric action occurring as you come down the hill is large if you're going to stay under control and not fall over. So the damage occurs to the actual structure within the muscle. So the sarcomere structure, the kind of that picture of the proteins that we have, that gets disrupted and moved around and damaged. Because the fiber gets damaged, then calcium can leak out into the surrounding tissue, and that can cause problems. We get an accumulation of irritants because the muscle has torn a little bit, and the irritants create water retention and edema, and so then we've got a little bit of swelling within the muscle, and that pushes on the nerve endings, and so that gets translated to pain. Okay. So typically, we're going to see more DOMS in an untrained individual, right? Which means that it's important we start with lower intensities, right? Less weight on the bar, or maybe no weight on the bar, just a bar, or maybe not even a bar, just free squats, right, to begin with, right? And then we use the principle of progressive overload. Once they can manage the lower intensity, we put a bit more weight on, and we let them work on that. Right? Progressive overload, we all do it without realizing that we're using a technical principle of training. Right? I train until that's easy to do, and then I put more work on. Right? So with a beginner, it's very important that we try to minimize the amount. I can't honestly say that you can negate DOMS. I mean, they're gonna get some soreness. But you wanna minimize that. You don't, I mean, for us, that kind of, oh my God, I can't move feeling, we kind of go, oh yes, I worked so hard because we're all a little nutty, right? For a beginner, that, oh my God, I can't move, my arm hurts so bad, I feel like someone kicked me in the, that's not a good feeling for someone who's a beginner, right? We don't want to put them there because they're going to go, I'm not doing that anymore, that hurt too much, right? So, the interesting thing is, and we'll probably come back to this later in the semester in other chapters, but when you're working with athletes, there's a good argument for making them sore early in the program when they come back, because that means that they're working the muscle the most hard. And the more damage I do, the more repairing there is, and the bigger the muscle can grow. So it's really a very different approach depending on who you're working with. You know, if I'm working with an athlete and I want them to grow, if our goal is growth, then I want to do quite a lot of damage, because then in fixing, the muscle grows at the same time. It lays down additional protein filaments, right? So again, depending upon your athlete, depending upon what the goal is, what part of the season or off season are you in, which part of your training plan are you in, making them deliberately sore by doing negatives or putting extra weight on the bar or making them run might be a good plan. Okay. But you want to avoid making them this sore in season, because when I'm that sore, power output goes down. And I don't want decreased power output during season. Right? I want them to be able to play, run, jump as hard as they can. So it's all, again, right? It's really clever. When do I do what kind of training? Okay? That's why you need people like LV, whose whole job is strength and conditioning. This graph I like just because of the little pictures, actually, because it gives us some interesting information about the length of the muscle and the force that it can generate. So this is, let me turn that light off because you need to be able to see the little myosin. So each of these is a sarcomere, right? And so what this graph is showing us is that each muscle has an optimal length for overlap of the actin and myosin. So the optimal overlap creates the optimal number of cross bridges and therefore the most amount of force for that movement. Okay. So if I'm here, if this is a bicep curl, right, here I'm right up here. And so there's a whole bundle of myosin heads here that have a whole bundle of actin here that don't line up with any myosin heads. So there's no force being produced in that little bit of the muscle fiber. Okay. Here, and down here, so I'm fully stretched out, and there's very little overlap there. Right? And here I've got optimal overlap. So on a bicep curl, depending upon the individual, because everybody's internal mechanics are slightly different, but the optimal point in a bicep curl is about 100 degrees, right? Picture what you see happen or what you feel happen when you train, but often what you see happen in a gym, right? How many times do you see this? Right? Because they put so much weight on the bar, they can control it here, but they can't control this, and they can't pick it up off their legs. Right? So either you see this, or you see people on the chin-up bar going, right? So they're only working one little range of overlap in the muscle, not the whole thing. So you'd be much better off to drop the weight and train the weaker parts of the muscle. How many times in sport do we only do this? Okay? Or only do, what movement is that in sport? I mean, that never happens. Right? So what's the point of training that? And then go into the sport and get hurt because the rest of the muscle range of movement is weak. Right? So each movement mechanically has this optimal overlap. But you want to train the whole range because that's the reality of transferring that exercise into sport. Unless you're a bodybuilder, right? I mean, if you're a bodybuilder and the goal is size, then this stuff has a purpose, right? Because they don't actually do anything except train and then walk out. So, I worked in a bodybuilding gym, very strange. Right, so we'll take a quick look at adaptations and then I've got your exams. Adaptations, right? Positive. They are positive in nature most of the time. So the adaptation that is going to occur to the training you are giving the muscle will allow that muscle to do the job more effectively. So the adaptation then is going to depend on which kind of stress you are applying to the muscle. Make sense? So, if I am doing aerobic work, right, then what I need to happen is a ton more oxygen availability in the cell so that I can make more ATP. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. Because if I'm working aerobically, I'm using system 3, and I need that oxygen sitting at the bottom of the electron transport chain to pick up my hydrogen ions so that I can keep moving for a long time. Okay? So, we see an increase in the number of capillaries that are wrapped around in the muscle and around the fibers. And we'll come back to that idea in the next chapter. We see an increase in the concentration of myoglobin. So myoglobin is the bus that picks up oxygen as it comes across into the muscle cell and helps to move it across to the mitochondria. Because oxygen in the muscle cell is no good. I have to have it in the mitochondria, right, where the electron transport chain is. So I have to be able to move oxygen across the cell. So if I'm working aerobically, I develop much higher levels of myoglobin so that I can shift more oxygen across the muscle cell. Once I've got the oxygen in the mitochondria, then it's like a car plant. If I've got one factory that can do 1 car per 10 minutes, if I want to make more cars, I can build another factory. Right? So we build another factory. If I work aerobically and I train aerobically, we increase the number of mitochondria within a muscle cell so that we've got more electron transport chain and more ATP being produced. Increased levels of the enzymes for Krebs cycle and for the electron transport chain is another adaptation. Which muscle fiber type are we going to see the most amount of adaptation occur?
Type 1.
Oh yeah, type 1, right? Because they're the slow, steady, constant contraction, very good at using oxygen, right? So we'll see some adaptation in type 2s, but we see way more adaptation in type 1s. Because they're doing the majority of the work, right? If my right arm is a type 1 and my left arm is a type 2, and my type 1 is doing this, and every now and then my type 2 is doing that, which one's going to get stronger? Right? Exactly the same. Right? So the adaptation is specific to A, the group of muscles that is doing the work, and B, the muscle fiber type that is doing the most amount of work. Okay? So we see, if you compare a rower with a runner has much more adaptation in their arms, their back, their shoulders, their chest. They do get some in their legs because they actually do work quite hard, depending on the type of rowing and the type of boat they're in. Some of them have seats that slide backwards and forwards, so they actually do use their legs quite a lot. But compared to a runner, whose adaptation is all going on in their lower body and not so much in their upper body, right? So if I'm working aerobically, the goal is increased delivery of oxygen, increased capability of using the oxygen once it's there. Right? Now, what about the size of the fiber? Okay? So this is pretty interesting because we tend to, I don't know about you, but I tend to assume that if I'm working a muscle, it's going to get larger, right? We're going to see hypertrophy of the muscle cell because I'm working it. However, right? Okay. So this is really cool and unexpected, I think, right? If this is my muscle fiber, and here's my capillary with my oxygen, right? Then my oxygen has to move from here to here before it can do any good. Does that make sense? Right? So actually, when we look at type 1 muscle fibers in someone who is aerobically trained, instead of getting bigger, their diameter gets smaller. Right? Because if my diameter is smaller, Now I've only got that much distance. Right? Cool, huh? Not what we expected. So we don't see a big change in the ratio, type 1s to type 2s, because that's genetically determined. It's possible that we see some type 2Xs start to behave more like a type 2A, which is better at using oxygen. So if I'm an endurance athlete, I'm really rarely going to use my type 2X unless I suddenly sprint. But those type 2As can help out a little bit. And so although we don't see a shift between type 2s to type 1s, we sometimes might see a shift from a type 2X towards a type 2A, so that it can help out a little bit more. Whole different ballgame when we look at resistance training. Okay? So with resistance training, we absolutely see an increase in the size of the muscle cell, hypertrophy. Right? So by training, by getting enough sleep, by eating properly, we add additional protein filaments to the fibers that are already there, and we see the fibers grow in size. Right? So we add more actin and myosin, and the fiber gets a bit bigger. Okay. Prenatally, we grow muscle fiber by hyperplasia, making new cells, and by hypertrophy, making the cells bigger. Postnatally, it is generally thought that any growth we see in muscle cell is due to hypertrophy. Recently, though, they've started to see what they're thinking of as hyperplasia, where under the right conditions, a muscle fiber will split into two muscle fibers. So I don't grow a new muscle fiber per se, but under the right conditions, I can split a muscle fiber that's there and end up with two. They've seen it in cats, so they do a great experiment with cats where they teach the cat to weight train, right? So they put a plate over its bowl, and it has to learn to push a lever to lift the lid up off the bowl so it can eat. Once it's learned the trick, then they start adding weight onto the lever to make the cat stronger, and then sadly they chop it off and do all the stuff. But we found this out, so it was really cool. Unless you were the cat, and then it wasn't so cool, right? But they think that this might occur with very, very high intensity resistance training. So powerlifters, bodybuilders, shot put throwers. I don't know, are you a shot put thrower? You are a shot put thrower? Okay, shot put thrower, right? So people who do very, very high intensity, very, very heavy weight lifting, they might see this occurring. The problem with that population is that they're also likely to use steroids. And so they don't know whether the hyperplasia is because of the high intensity training or because of the steroid use. at the moment. Right, we don't know the answer right now. So type 1s and type 2s can grow in response to weight training, depending on what kind of resistance work you're doing. If you're doing a more conventional, old-fashioned type of program, then you're going to see more hypertrophy in the type 2s than in the type 1s. Right? We may still see some type 2Xs start to work like type 2As, depends whether you're doing very short rep numbers or whether you're doing sets of 8 to 10. Minimal amount of change between fiber types again. All right? And we don't have time to do that because I want to get that back. So I will do that last slide Wednesday before we jump into the next chapter. Okay, Keith's not here. Ian. Don't take these home, please, because I have not logged them. So check my adding up. If you've got questions there that you think you might be able to answer, then come see me sometime next week. See if you can give me an answer. I can give you some more points.